I'm Lori, and our talk today is going to be about tips for raising book lovers. And this is important to me because I happen to be an adult with dyslexia who is a book lover, and I raised 4 children who all happen to be dyslexic, and I'd say at least 3 out of 4 are solid book lovers. And then, of course, I end up working for a living with dyslexic learners. So this is a near and dear to my heart kind of project. The first thing that I think is super important is to remember that reading is supposed to be fun. And when we assign it, we're like, oh, everybody's going to read today and we're doing 30 minutes in the living room, all of us together, not typically a fun experience. However, there's a way to build to that point where everybody has a book and they want to read. So let's start with that first tip. And that first one is you want to create a culture of reading. A family culture of reading. And that statistic about, good readers have more books in their homes than non-readers is accurate, but also a little bit skewed, because if you have a lot of books in your home but nobody's reading them, it doesn't do you a bit of good. So one of those things that we talk about that I'll cover in more detail in a second is about reading. How do you get your kids to read is by reading to them first. And we do it automatically when they're little. It's when they're bigger that we have a problem with it. We sort of forget and we're like, well, now you're a second grader and you're going to read your own. Instead, we should keep doing that. And here's why. If parents are reading to their kids, you'd create first a common culture, right? A positive common culture, because you've all read the same story, you're all talking about it. It's like, oh, wow, what do you think of this? And it can be, how do you feel this character feels, or how do you know what's going to happen next? That whole storyline that you're all working on together becomes this kind of family memory. And I think there was a book that we read when the kids were younger. It was for school, so I suppose maybe 4th grade was my oldest, and it was called Matilda Bone, and it had a lot to do with medieval time period, okay? And we had a blast with that book because she wasn't a very good apprentice. But one of the things my kids learned was how to swear medievally. And the phrase they used was saliva mucasque for about a month, which means spit and slime. So I wasn't too offended. But we all had that in common. And when they would yell it and all giggle, we all knew what it was about. It was a family memory. I think about another piece that is really important as an educator is my students need to be able to hear what good reading sounds like, what that phrasing sounds like, what that syntax sounds like. And if they don't hear it frequently, if it's not a consistent example, it's really hard for them to replicate when it's their turn to read. It's also an opportunity to explain new vocabulary, like what is saliva, right? What does that actually mean? And to pause the story enough to explain it to someone means that they're taking in way more, they're comprehending way more in that book than anything else. Before I realized that my kids were dyslexic, they always tested really high in vocab. And I had no idea that that was unusual for dyslexic learners or struggling readers. But it had a lot to do with all of that reading that we'd done as a family. They knew those words. They understood the word ricochet, or they understood the word smelt, or any of the other things that we had gotten into in family reading time. And so another piece that you get when you are working with reading out loud is you get to talk about the storyline. What do you think is going to happen next? How do you think that character feels? Or what do you guess is going to be inside the box? Whatever it is, all of a sudden, we've got our kids engaged in the story. We've got them not just mindlessly listening, but really thinking about it and getting their information back together, communicating with each other on what they might think or what they might not think. when we talk about the storyline as a team, as a family, all of a sudden you can get everyone discussing it together. They get different ideas on what they think might be important, or what's in that box, or how that person might be feeling. And it builds that critical thinking piece that we desperately need. And it builds it in a way that is fun for our kids. I also think one of the pieces that was important growing up, and also with my own children, was making where we were reading fun. And sometimes we did it, you know, outside, under the trees. I remember reading Heidi under the trees, and the wind was going through the firs, and I just remember thinking, you know, this is probably pretty accurate. I also think, if we go back to that crazy Matilda Bone book, we kind of went all out and borrowed or picked up from our local appliance store a whole bunch of those massive refrigerator boxes, and we built this crazy fort, and, you know, castle style, since that was the time that we were in. And all of a sudden it was all about the adventure, as well as us building it together and reading inside. And that thing sat on our front yard until, you know, the rain pretty much destroyed it. But it was a solid week of absolute fun inside that fort. And we got a chance to really enjoy the story in a whole nother element, right? You want also to allow for a little bit of wiggles, especially with our younger kids, right? If they can be playing with their Legos or coloring or drawing or something while you're reading, it's not going to keep them from being engaged in the story. It is going to keep them occupied and relatively quiet and still engaged in your family activity. Now, let me give you a few examples of what we call expressive reading is going to require. Because as the parent, we have to make this example, our reading out loud, something that first is enjoyable, and second, that they're going to want to replicate. I remember my mom doing Chronicles of Narnia with all the voices, and she made it just come alive for us as we were sitting. I'm sure the one night I remember is sitting in our bunk beds waiting for her to come and tell us more of what was happening in the wardrobe. And so first, voices, change your voices, make them slower, or add an accent if you're comfortable, or make them deep, anything that you can to make it more interesting. Another one is facial expression. The best thing we can do is show on our faces, especially for our younger learners, what we're meaning, what we're feeling, by using that facial expression. So when they hear the word smug, they know what it means, right? Because we've given them a solid facial example. And also think about the volume and the speed when we read. One of the pieces that I've learned as far as auditory processing with our dyslexic learners is a lot of our kids need it done at a slower rate. They take in that auditory information at a slower point. So reading the story fast, just so that we can get done with it or we can get to the exciting part, isn't always our best choice. It would be better if you can just slow it down so that those dyslexic learners who need it at that rate can hear it and absorb it easily. Another great thing then is also to ask a question every so often in your story, and it sort of gives them a chance to catch up on what they've been hearing and absorbing, and they can slow down for a second, answer the question, and then jump back in. That's also very helpful. And just to remember, it's supposed to be fun. So if you make a mistake and, make a word, say a word incorrectly, that's okay. We need them to also remember that reading isn't ever going to be perfect, and that they're going to make mistakes a long time after they've grown up. And as an adult, I still make mistakes. And when I tell a student that and they're like, oh yeah, yep, Miss Lori just botched another one, that's fine, because it gives them the permission to do that same thing, and it shows them that it's not a big deal. The next piece to think about is find good books. Don't just wander through the Scholastic Book Fair hoping that the latest and greatest in there is going to be what works for your child, because the Scholastic Book Fair is an awesome fundraiser, but it doesn't always have exactly what your learner needs. So let's talk about parts of that. First, snuggle up to your local librarian or those friends of yours that seem to be reading something all the time. Your friendly bibliophiles. Yep, that would be one category I'm definitely in. And use those resources. Ask questions. Be like, hey, what are the biggest things that are flying out of the library right now? Or do you have a series that you know would work good for horse lovers in middle school? Those kinds of questions can give a librarian a real great opportunity to think about your particular child. Because first thing we want is something that your student is going to love based on what they're interested in. If I have someone who is totally into nonfiction and I hand them a book about fairies, it's not gonna jazz them at all. So there's my first piece you want to use is pick something that's in their interest level. Whatever, that's a huge one. It doesn't matter whether it's above their current reading level or below. We'll talk about that in a minute. Their interest level is really, really important. Then, I hate to say it, but as a parent, budget for books. Because going to the library is all fine and dandy, except that we have a tendency to lose them, or they don't get them read in the 2-week time period, or something else goes wrong. And so for me, I always felt much better, instead of paying the fines that seemed to happen because we lost a book underneath somebody's bed, was to give them the opportunity to pick out some of their own books from places that were affordable. If you've ever been on Amazon looking at books, they often have a used book section. So you don't always have to purchase it brand new. There's also a wonderful website called thriftbooks.com, also affiliated with Amazon, but I have found some great things on there, and it just meant that we could have the whole series at our house once I knew one student was fired up about it, and I didn't have to wait until we could get it from the library or purchase it new every time. So that was huge. I also found that if we had plenty of options in our house, and my student who was huge into nonfiction wasn't maybe psyched about horses right now, Badgers, if it were at the house, was an okay option, and we could kind of get over that bump of, I don't know what I want to read right now. And that really made a huge difference. Now, we talked about reading levels lower than their reading level. We've also talked about reading when it's right in their reading level. And then we come back to that reading level that's above what they can read on their own. And that's where, as a family, you read out loud. And that piece is important for a lot of reasons. But the first one is, our guys are usually able to comprehend and understand a much more complicated storyline than what they can read. So first, we're feeding into what they enjoy, right? We're picking a book that they would like, but we're also allowing for those complex characters, that multi-level storyline, interesting subplots, and that continues to build that interest in reading. It also is going to give that example of phrasing, build that vocabulary, raise that comprehension, right? And that understanding of sentence structure. So there's our reasons why. Now, we still need it to be fun, right? So you can expand that learning by doing book-themed activities. If I go back to that crazy Matilda Bone book, that was the year that we also hit the Renaissance Festival. And we tried Peas Porridge Hot, if you remember that poem. Peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot 5 days old. Well, we gave that a shot. Everyone decided it was a terrible idea. But it was an awesome experience. You can do a camp out and read Cowboy Small. You can come up with an activity for just about every book. I was really thankful that my kids didn't get completely obsessed with Call of the Wild, because wolves were not my thing. Another piece that's super important is for our older kids, because we're talking about our youngers right now, and our littles are a little more cajolable. True? When you get to middle school, we see this strange phenomenon of eye rolls and whatevers, and sometimes you can't tell if you even know what they're interested in reading anymore. Well, that's often the time where we still can use reading as our common culture. Okay, this next tip is for our older students, middle school, high school. Now they're proficient readers, but we struggle a little bit more with time. Like, do you have a lot of time to sit together and talk or to read out loud as a group? Schedules get crazy. And so we have to come up with another solution that still gives them the support that they need and doesn't detract from the fun of reading a book. So one of the things I do is read whatever they're reading, not necessarily with them, but at the same time, or read it ahead of them so that you know what they are going to be delving into. Once again, common culture, right? There's somebody to talk about it with. But it also gives them you to bounce those ideas off of, to ask the questions about subplots, to give them somebody who's going to say, so where are you in the story? So what's happened so far? Oh, I love that part. Or aren't you frustrated? Even if you're not doing it at the exact same time, it gives you both that, hey, let's chat about your book. And it also allows for you to deal with any issues within the book that they might not be familiar with or have questions about. Maybe it's in a different country or a different time period, and you can give them a little more insight. I think it also keeps you connected in a way that is hugely important. Hugely important. So now that we know what we're looking for with our kids and what we're going to do with them, we have to start thinking about our books. And there are a couple of things that are interesting about books that make it easier for our students to read. So the first one is font size. If the font is super small or super tight together, it's really hard for our kids to get fired up about reading, mountains of text. And so take a look when you're at the library. Is there even a large print version? Is there, you can have 3 different variants of Anne of Green Gables, but one of them might have a wider font or wider margins. That's going to be an easier book for your student to read. Even if it looks thicker, it will be easier to read. Font size also helps with that, and that space between the lines. If you'll notice in this one, you can see that there's some significant space between the lines, say something that's much tighter. And as you go through your own books, you'll be like, oh, this is one that would be a smaller font, or, maybe a little bit more intimidating. Obviously, cover art can grab a child, get them fired up, or it might turn them off. So, take a look at what kind of book covers your student is getting fired up on, because those too can be different based on who printed it or what version it is. So, and I've got some kids who really prefer hardcovers to soft covers. So keep that in mind. If you've got a learner who really likes the heft of that book, that can be a huge plus. Or maybe they're the kid who prefers the digital, or the digital copy, and would rather read it off of their iPad or tablet or Kindle. So keep that in mind too. It seems like we mostly have kids who are in one camp or the other, but I happen to be one of those that will do it in any format I can get. I like having the hardcover personally because it lives in my library significantly longer, but then I can switch from the Audible to the hardcover when I need to, especially if I'm in a really good part. I actually listen much slower than I read, so if I can read it, I can get through something faster. So that's another piece. Now, when we think about Audibles, they're there for a couple of really great reasons, and I highly recommend them, especially if you are a dyslexic parent and not comfortable with reading, because you then get the opportunity to hear that same story with everyone else, and you're not so stressed about what it looks like or how you sound, or are you stumbling over the words. You can be honest with your kids. if you can say, you know what, reading anything longer than, you know, a picture book gives me massive anxiety with you guys. So I kind of like to do it this way instead. They're going to understand that because they have been or are going through exactly what you went through as a kid. Using those audibles also gives you a chance to read something that's at a much higher level, you know, what your friends might be talking about. And it will build your common culture, not only with your family, but with the rest of the people that are readers in your life. I also think you still need to read on your own if you're that dyslexic parent, but maybe you're going to do magazines or recipe books or something to build you up so that you get more comfortable with reading as well. Let's face it, it is monkey see, monkey do. Now, there's one other thing to keep in mind, and that's scotopic sensitivity, or also known as Irlen syndrome. And that's when the white of the page is much brighter to our reader than the black letters. Because of that, they sometimes see those letters swim or move, circular patterns, or they see what look like rivers between the words. If your student is saying that, then it's a good chance that they have that scotopic sensitivity. You can spend a lot of money getting it diagnosed and, you know, buy the majorly expensive glasses, or you can simply find a way for them to get their reading material on something that's tinted. I had to laugh. My youngest always loved, you know, the color, the black on, you know, if you could read it on your computer, he liked the black, and now I know why. My oldest preferred old Scholastic books because they had already yellowed, and so for her it was less abrasive visually. Now you can change the color of your background on your Kindle easily, or you can get worksheets or homework put on, say, blue paper instead of white paper. Remember that students with scotopic sensitivity are going to need shorter reading times as they get used to things. They might not be able to read more than 10 minutes at first before their eyes start to water, but you can stretch that out as they get better and better at reading. I'm glad you had a chance to check out this video. And I hope that the tips that I give you will make it easier for you and your family to feel successful when it comes to reading. Thanks so much.